Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 2022 midterm generic ballot polling and other polls around the country, and really why I think Republicans are doing so poorly in the polls right now. Currently we're about a week into August, and so far Republicans are about tied in the generic ballot, and they're trailing in a number of not just purple states but also red states like Ohio. So we'll be taking a look at the national polls as well as some of those statewide polls and kind of seeing why I think Republicans are down and what I think could change the trajectory of those polls. So we're going to dive into all of those in just a second. But first, if you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing down below and liking this video if you enjoy. So anyway, let's get straight into it. So the generic ballot has tightened up a lot really since about the month of January. You know, Republicans have been ahead by a decent amount in the generic ballot throughout the entire year, up until relatively recently. If we look at the RCP graph here for the generic ballot, the Republicans really started to drop off in July. And again, that was slightly after the whole Dobbs decision, which was at the end of June. So that could have been a lag in the polling because of that. But really, you saw a big dive in Republican support overall. Now, this is something that isn't necessarily new in red year midterms. We saw this in 2014 as well. And really, since after the 2014 midterms, polling typically does tend to underestimate Republicans. We saw that not just in red wave years like 2014, 2016, but we also saw that in 2018 in some of the key Senate races early on, places like Missouri, Indiana. You know, these are states that Trump won by safe margins in 2016. And in 2018, Democrats were actually leading in the polls there for quite some time and making it very competitive. So we'll take a look at some of those statewide numbers in just a second. But why are Republicans doing so poorly on the national ballot? For one, I think there is a bit of a sampling bias in the summertime. We've seen that in 2014 as well, where less Republicans are answering these polls. And also because Republicans tend to be underestimated at this time of the year. We saw this back in 2014 as well, which honestly, Republicans are in a better position now in terms of the generic ballot polling than they were in 2014. Republicans in 2014 were down in the generic ballot by about 2 points around this time of the year. So early August, late July, they were down by about 2.2%, the RCP average of polls. And since then, you know, you start to see this lag as well throughout August. And then once Labor Day hits, Republican numbers shoot back up. We start to get more reliable polls. And I think that's the key point, is that a lot of the polls that are coming out in the summer and early on in the midterm season are not the most reliable. They're typically campaign internal polls. They're registered voter polls, which tend to overestimate Democrats' chances. We've seen this in basically every race. Registered voters tend to favor Democrats overall. And I think we're going to see the same thing play out in 2022. Now, there's a number of unique factors in 2022 I also want to talk about. One of them being, of course, the Trump factor. You know, Democrats have been trying to make the midterms about a referendum on President Trump because Biden is currently extremely unpopular around the country. He's underwater by about 16, 17 points, give or take. And in some polls, he's even down by 20. But in the aggregate, he's down by a pretty sizable margin. He's down by around 16 points. So obviously, Democrats don't want the midterm to be about Biden. So they're trying to make it about Trump. They're trying to make the Republicans tied to Trump, J6, all these other things, because they know if the midterms are a referendum on Biden, they will do very poorly in November. Now, another reason why I think the polls are so close right now is, of course, we've had a number of pretty messy primaries, mainly in the state of Pennsylvania, but also in Arizona, too. You saw a pretty ugly primary between two top contenders, and Pennsylvania was really a three-way race. So ultimately, you saw a lot of competitiveness in these primaries, but in some ways, it's also a good thing for Republicans because it means they're energized for this election. Republican primary turnout has been very high, but I think overall, these primaries have been a lot more divisive than they've needed to be, and I think the nominees, especially in the state of Pennsylvania, tearing each other down is hurting Republicans in the short term with some of these polls. Now, candidate quality is another factor I think plays into the failure of Republicans right now to kind of regain a strong lead in the generic ballot, because two to 3 points this early on, you know, earlier back in March, the spring of 2022, were pretty good numbers because the conventional wisdom was that Republicans could only grow from there. And of course, obviously the Dobbs decision, the whole abortion debate around the country was sort of a black swan event, a little bit unexpected before the midterms. And it did kind of impact the midterms in some ways. It did hurt Republicans, I think, in certain blue states. But I think overall in the swing states And the red states, the dynamic really hasn't changed all that much. The results from the Kansas abortion referendum, I really don't think hurt the GOP as much as many people are saying it will, especially when it gets down to general election season. And given the fact that nearly anywhere from 20 to 30% of Republicans voted no against the pro-life amendment in Kansas. So I don't really think necessarily abortion is this cut and dry, super partisan issue. Because it's not. There's crossover support. You have about a third of Republicans that are pro-choice, and you've got about 10% of Democrats that are pro-life. So it's not exactly a super partisan issue when you get down to the ballot questions. But I do think candidate quality matters in states that are important to win for the Republicans. You know, if we take a look back at the 2020 elections, a lot of these states that are up for key elections, Wisconsin, Michigan, Georgia, Arizona, all of these states theoretically should be locks for the GOP. Georgia was a state Biden only won by about 0.2%. Arizona is a state that Biden only won by 0.3%. 1.2% for Biden, Pennsylvania, 0.6% in Wisconsin. These are states that typically you would think the Republicans should be crushing in. But I think there's a number of reasons why that isn't the case yet. First off, we'll take a look at the Rust Belt, and then I'll talk about Arizona and Georgia. And also rope in Ohio in the Rust Belt, because I think Ohio is a race where the polling has been really terrible. And I think that's the case with a lot of these Rust Belt states. Because Rust Belt polls tend to oversample Democrats, because Democrats still have a partisan registration advantage over Republicans. And I think a lot of these early polls aren't exactly weighted that well. If we take a look at Pennsylvania real quick, some of the latest polls that we have out of Pennsylvania, for instance, Dr. Oz is doing very poorly in them. You know, in the average, Fetterman is up by 8, Fetterman is up by 11, Fetterman's up by about 10. Now, I'm not saying that John Fetterman is going to lose in 2022. I still think Oz is the favorite, but I'm not trying to make any real solid forecast in this video. But I am saying is that there's no way that Fetterman is going to win by 8 points in Pennsylvania. No way he's going to win by 11 or any of these crazy margins. You know, even in a worst case scenario for Republicans, I would say Dr. Oz's floor is about 45, 46%. And even then, I don't think that's likely at all. But we have some polls out of Pennsylvania, one from Momentive, which is sponsored by Center Street PAC, which is an anti-Oz PAC. They've endorsed Fetterman. And, you know, these polls have Fetterman up by 17 points. One of the polls has Fetterman up by about 14. So these polls have Fetterman up by ridiculous margins. It's a Democratic-sponsored poll. You know, this really isn't reliable at all. You have likely voters where Fetterman's up by 14. Again, a really small sample size, large margin of error. Registered voters, and then just adults in general. You know, obviously it's a very slanted poll. They're going to try and pose questions that are going to make the electorate less likely to support Oz. Fox News is another one. Fox News early polls tend to always favor Democrats. We saw that in Virginia earlier on, and then towards the end their polls got a lot more accurate. And the rest of these polls, all of these polls are partisan polls, whether they're Democratic partisan polls or Republican partisan polls. And even some of the Republican partisan polls, like this one here, the PEM Management Corporation is a John Bolton super PAC, and John Bolton is not a fan of Trump Republicans, or really Republicans in general at the moment. So I don't really think a lot of these polls out of Pennsylvania are really reliable. And by extension, I feel the same way about the polls in Ohio, because Ohio is a state that wasn't even that close in 2020. It was a state that Donald Trump won by 8.1%, despite the national environment going for the Democrats by nearly 5 percentage points. So I really don't think that it's realistic to say that Tim Ryan can win this race. Even if he's running a good ad campaign right now, I don't think it's realistic, objectively speaking. So if we take a look at the polls out of Ohio, you have the same sort of issue. You have the same pollsters polling these races. Momentive, which has Tim Ryan up by 10, Tim Ryan up by 11. We all know, even Democrats know, that these aren't going to be the margins out of Ohio. So I think a lot of the polling in the Rust Belt has just been bad partisan polling mainly. You know, even these early polls, I think really haven't been too well. Momentive early on had J.D. Vance leading somehow, but now they have J.D. Vance down by a colossal margin. And, you know, I have criticisms of J.D. Vance as a candidate in terms of how well I think he can perform. I think he's not running really the best campaign right now. Obviously, that can change. But he has been doing a lot of events in Israel and other countries and hasn't really been campaigning even in Ohio as of late. His team has, but he himself hasn't up until recently. And the same situation kind of happened with Oz too. Oz was on vacation for a while. So I think in a number of these races, Democrats have been seizing unique opportunities to kind of build up a lead on top of the fact that these pollsters are very partisan. They're Democratic partisan polls. Looking at Wisconsin, I don't think the polls are as off the ball as they were in Pennsylvania and Ohio. You know, they have Tony Evers up by a couple of points. That's pretty believable, honestly. You don't really have momentum doing polls in Wisconsin, but I'm sure if they did, they'd probably have Tony Evers up by 12 points or something. But I don't think Rust Belt polling is particularly reliable this early on. Now, I'm not discounting that the Democrats win seats in the Rust Belt. They win races in the Rust Belt. It's very possible, but I think it's still unlikely given the national environment. And once Labor Day passes, I think you're going to see a better characterization of these races reflected in the polling. Because right now, I don't think we're really getting that, especially out of the Rust Belt. I think some of the polls are very, very biased. There's no way Tim Ryan is winning Ohio by 11 points. There's no way Dr. Oz is losing by 12 in Pennsylvania. And these are polls that are being put in the aggregates. That's why you have John Fetterman up by 11 points. You have Tim Ryan up by 4. So I really don't think these polls are very reflective of what's actually going to happen in November. And I think by extension, you're seeing this play out all across the country. You know, if we take a look at FiveThirtyEight, for instance, their Senate rating went, I think, when they first released their model, had Republicans at a 55 in 100 chance to win. Now they only have a 41 in 100 chance to win. And that's mainly because of these national and statewide polls that are heavily favoring Democrats that they're putting into their models. You know, they have John Fetterman winning in Pennsylvania by 3.2%. They have Mark Kelly winning in the state of Arizona with 50.8% of the vote. They still have Ron Johnson winning in Wisconsin, I guess because the polls aren't that bad for him, but we'll see how Wisconsin polling bears out throughout this race, because Wisconsin polling tends to be very slanted in favor of Democrats. You know, there were polls in Wisconsin back in 2020 that had Biden up by 6 points, 8 points, and at the end of the day, Wisconsin was the third closest state in the entire country. So I really don't think these early polls are very reliable, especially the national polls. And even if Republicans, hypothetically, are only up by 0.1% on election day, I still expect them to overperform that average by about 2 to 3 points. So even if Republicans are leading the generic ballot by just 2 or 3 points, based on the 2020 map, a lot of these races are going to be way more in favor of the Republicans than you'd expect. Pennsylvania is a state for the first time since the 1920s voted right of the nation in 2 consecutive elections. I think it's the same with Michigan as well. So there is a shift going on in the Rust Belt, and I don't necessarily think that this polling out of the Rust Belt is very accurate. I'm not discounting that somebody like Fetterman or Shapiro or Evers can win in Michigan, but I don't think they're going to win by these giant margins. And that's really the point of this video, is I think the polling is very misleading, and I think there's some in political spheres that are trying to use this bad polling to try and spin a narrative that 2022 is going to be some sort of blue wave year, which I wholeheartedly reject based on the lagging economy, Biden's approval rating, and of course the historical trends overall in midterm elections. The out party is always more energized, and that has been the case without fail since at least 2002. So I don't expect that to change in 2022. Even despite Republicans, I think, fielding some weak candidates in a number of key states, I still think the national environment is going to lead them to overperform. Now, some of them may lose, some of them may win, but I think they're going to do a lot better than people expect them to do based on the turnout differential that's likely to happen in November. So that's really my brief video on the polls that are going on. I really think that we have to wait until Labor Day to get reliable polls, not just out of the swing states, but on the national level as a whole, to kind of get a better picture of what 2022 is going to be like. And if Democrats are still leading by, you know, after Labor Day, mid-September, then I think for Republicans, it's a real wake-up call and a red alarm, because that means that they're in a lot of trouble. You know, 2022 is a year where I think Republicans should do very well in all of these key states and across the country, based on the fact that they're given such favorable electoral circumstances. Again, Biden is unpopular, the economy is lagging, people are worried about the future of the country, and I think all of those issues kind of collide together to help Republicans overall. And again, 2018 was the same deal. You know, Republicans were the in party, they were very unpopular, and I think some people trying to make the comparison that 2018 is going to be similar to 2022, and that, you know, Democrats might win the Senate and Republicans win the House. I don't necessarily agree with either, because the 2018 Senate map was very different than what we saw back, what we're seeing now in 2022. You know, all of the states that Republicans won, excluding Florida, which I guess you can include Florida because Florida was a Trump state, but these 3 states, North Dakota, Missouri, and Indiana, these were all states that Trump and Republicans won by safe margins 2 years prior. Florida was a state that Trump won, and that kind of was more indicative of a trend overall, but I don't think any of these Rust Belt states in particular are trending to the left. If anything, I think if there was some sort of upset victory by Democrats, it wouldn't be here in the Rust Belt, but it would be somewhere in the Southwest, in a state like Arizona, let's say, or maybe a state like Georgia, where I think the incumbents there, particularly in the Senate, Mark Kelly and Raphael Warnock, are very strong candidates. So I think if there's anywhere where the Democrats are going to outperform, it would probably be those two states, because those are also two states that are trending towards the Democrats. The Rust Belt, over the past few cycles, has overall been trending away from the Democrats. Republicans have been doing better in these states than they have in decades. So if anything, I think if there's any place where Republicans underperform, it's going to be in the Sun Belt and not the Rust Belt. But that's another point. I just wanted to bring that up because I think that really until Labor Day, we're not going to have a clear picture of what the midterms are going to pan out to be like. And there's a lot of people already jumping to conclusions that Republicans are going to lose the midterms outright. They're going to, barely win the House and they're going to lose the Senate. Republicans could still lose the Senate. But what I'm trying to say is that I think people need to wait longer for more accurate data to come out, because a lot of the polls that are coming out of these states are Democrat sponsored. They're oversampling Democrats. The crosstabs aren't really too great. And I think it's painting a misleading picture for the midterms going ahead. So anyway, that's it for today's video. Please leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification so you don't miss any more videos I put out. And as always, again, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.